During the 70s and 80s, lots of queer villages evolved in cities all over the world. But Vancouver is very unique in one important respect. It has evolved not just one, but two queer villages. The Davie Street Village is one of the most vibrant, colorful, and rainbow-filled villages on the continent. And another that is a lot less overt and colorful and a little bit more subdued and underground. My name is Glenn, and I am a queer storyteller and the proud creator of the Really Gay History Tour, which I lead with Forbidden Vancouver walking tours every week here in Vancouver, Canada. And today we're gonna get into a story that I don't normally get to cover, and that is the story of these two villages and why they differ so much from each other. And the main reason for that is money. This video is sponsored by Van City Credit Union, who have been proud supporters of the queer community since before it was cool to do so. Going right back to the early 2000s, Van City was the first major financial institution on the continent to openly come out as supporters of the queer community, and I want to thank them for supporting this video. These beautiful heritage houses behind me will give you a very clear indication of what sort of person was inhabiting the West End shortly after the city was incorporated. This was a neighborhood for the wealthy, because this beautiful neighborhood is obviously so close to Stanley Park and to English Bay and the other beaches. But throughout the Great Depression, many of these wealthy homeowners began to leave for other neighborhoods that they thought were more up and coming. And some of the houses that they left behind were subdivided into boarding rooms, and this became a neighborhood for renters. And in the following decades, lots of low-rise apartments were built. And then throughout the 60s, lots of high-rise apartments. The population grew, and all throughout this time, there was a growing population of gay men. On the one side, you've got the age-old cruising grounds of Stanley Park, where men had long since made connections with each other in an area that they believed was safe because it was remote and out of the way. And on the other side, there were lots of hotel bars that had started becoming clandestine hookup spots for gay men. So right in the middle of all of it is this affordable neighborhood with one-bedroom apartments. This was a natural place for gay men to begin congregating. During that time, even more gay bars started opening up in the Granville Street area. This was an underground scene. It was nothing like a modern-day queer village. But by the time we get to the late 70s and early 80s, there were also bars starting to open up on Davie. And what was happening on Davie was going to be dramatically different than the closeted bar scene of Granville. This empty, ugly parking lot was once the site of a really important bookstore that lots of you will know and love. Little Sisters Book and Art Emporium. It's still open, many of you know, on Davie Street at its second location, but this is where it opened in 1983. It was an important bookstore to our community for many reasons, including for the persecution that they faced, including persecution from Customs Canada, and for the victory that they won. But there is one respect in which this bookstore was also very important to our community. This is one of the first places opening up on Davie Street in the early 1980s that had a visible queer presence that was not a bar. It was a bookstore. Soon there would be other spots on Davie Street as well, like coffee shops and diners that would have an open gay presence. This was the beginnings of a village. This was a place where people gathered to build community and they could hear each other. It wasn't a noisy bar. So they didn't just come here to shop for books, they came here to talk and to have a coffee and to build community. But just as these bookstores and coffee shops and diners and bars were opening up on Davie Street, there was another village emerging elsewhere in the city. Commercial Drive is one of the most fun and festive streets in the entire city. And yet it has somehow remained one of Vancouver's best kept secrets. It's a street that locals love and flock here by the hundreds to visit, but it has somehow managed to stay off the radar of tourists for the most part. And so it's a hidden gem and a little secret of ours that we get to keep to ourselves. But it is not, at least visibly, a queer village. In fact, the crosswalks behind me are not rainbows. Those are the colors of the Italian flag. And you would be hard-pressed to find a rainbow flag anywhere on the drive, and unless your gaydar is really finely attuned to it, you wouldn't necessarily even detect a queer presence here. So why would I say that this is a queer village? While lots of wealthy homeowners were scooping up all the available real estate in the West End in the early 20th century, that meant that what was left over for everyone else who couldn't afford it was the land that was east of downtown. So here in the Grandview Woodland area, which is just off of Commercial Drive, that was early on lots of Italian and Portuguese families. And to this day, Commercial Drive really exhibits a strong Italian and Portuguese influence. But as the decades wore on, other minority groups began to move into this neighborhood as well. Groups that wouldn't have necessarily thought that they had a lot in common when they were living elsewhere in the world. But once they were living here side by side with each other, they found that they had a lot of common cause living in Canada. Throughout the 1970s, as more and more queer people began coming out of the closet, lots of gay men and queer people who had been assigned male were scooping up all the available apartments in the West End. But lots of lesbians and queer people who had been assigned female were looking for something a little bit more affordable. And right here was this more affordable neighborhood with lots and lots of big houses that hadn't yet been subdivided into smaller units, which meant that they could build community in their houses and through dinner parties and through backyard barbecues and potlucks in a neighborhood that was still close enough to downtown, but in a neighborhood that was also a hotbed for political activism. And it was also a neighborhood that was full of minority groups, which for many women made it very appealing for them. But that would also prove to be a problem for them, because many of the ethnic groups who lived in this neighborhood had embraced very traditional values when it came to families and especially to gender roles. And so for the growing number of lesbians that were living in this neighborhood, they were beginning to find themselves in a state of friction with it. The lesbians of this neighborhood did not stay confined to their backyards and communal houses. As they grew in number over the years, they began to find public spaces to hang out right here on the drive. Right behind me is a legendary lesbian hangout that is open to this day. Joe's Cafe was opened in 1976 to serve the Portuguese community of this neighborhood. And the way that the lesbian community began to infiltrate, interweaving itself with the pre-existing clientele here, is sort of indicative of the way they did the same throughout this entire neighborhood, becoming a part of a pre-existing population, which is very different than what was happening in the West End, where queer-owned businesses for a specifically queer clientele were taking up space and kind of establishing a prominently queer village. For the most part, they were accepted here just fine and even welcomed here, until one day in 1990 when two women in the cafe shared a kiss. And for that, they were kicked out. So the lesbian community responded by staging a kiss-in protest. Right outside the doors of the cafe, lesbians were smooching everywhere. It should be noted that to this day, Joe's Cafe markets itself prominently on the homepage of its website as an LGBT-friendly establishment. Not too long after the kiss-in, another cafe opened not very far from here that was specifically lesbian-oriented and, believe it or not, was actually lesbian-owned. Just off the drive, right here on Charles Street, there was a little coffee shop right behind me called Josephine's. Its name was not a reference to Joe's Cafe or a feminization of that cafe's name, although I think it's hilarious that it sounds like it could be. And this little lesbian-owned coffee shop was one of a small handful of places that ever opened up in this neighborhood that was lesbian-owned and oriented towards lesbians, as queer women finally began to claw their way out of the economic marginalization that had defined their community for decades and that had established them in this neighborhood. This little cafe was financed, it turns out, by the sponsor of this video, Vancity, which, going all the way back to the 60s, was the first financial institution in all of Canada to offer loans to women without a male cosigner. The overarching and very binary gender divide that was such a part of society at this time, which caused our two villages to evolve along such distinct lines, left trans and non-binary people without a clear place to identify. Trans women were often being thought of as gay men and grouped in to that community, and they were hanging out in the West End, whereas trans men were often being thought of as lesbians or even identifying themselves as lesbians and were hanging out within the lesbian community. And all of that makes it very noteworthy that here at Josephine's in the early 90s, there was a group of trans women who were gathering on a regular basis, holding monthly events in a neighborhood that was defined by and for queer women. The gender divide that we have been talking about is not the only economic divide that our community faced and that affected us throughout our history. There was another divide running this way that was racialized. Queer people of color, including Two-Spirit people, were often kept on the fringes of both of these villages, if not excluded from them altogether. And that was sometimes due to economic reasons, but sometimes it was due to the overarching racism of the society, which our community was not immune to. But all of that is beginning to change. Nowadays, there's a lot more fluidity between these two neighborhoods, not just of gay men and lesbians, but more and more of all the diverse members of the 2S LGBTQIA+ spectrum, and not just between these neighborhoods, but beyond them as well, into other neighborhoods and suburbs and even smaller communities. And this is no doubt a very good thing, because it means we are becoming more and more accepted and integrated within mainstream Canadian society. But it is coming at a cost. And here too, we see money and economics playing a big role in our story. As these neighborhoods become more desirable to live in large part because they are so colorful and vibrant and diverse and inclusive and queer, they are becoming harder and harder to afford. And that means that queer people, unless they happen to have means, are getting priced out of neighborhoods that they helped to make cool in the first place. And at a time when our rights and freedoms are far from guaranteed, it is not ideal for us to be losing our village and losing a space that has traditionally kept us safe and helped to define us. And it raises the question, can we remain a community without a village? For even more queer history, hit the subscribe button or go to thepinkhat.ca. Thanks again to Van City for sponsoring this video. I'll see you in the next video.